Money FM 89.3. Best of breakfast. Breakfast Special.
Welcome to Breakfast Special with me, Emaad Akhtar. It's the end of an era. Singapore-based low-cost carrier Jetstar Asia will be ceasing operations later tonight, the 31st of July, after 2 decades as part of what its parent company, Australian carrier Qantas, calls a strategic restructure. It has raised some key questions about the viability of the low-cost carrier model, which we will be diving into right now with Brendan Sobie. He's an independent analyst and consultant at Sobie Aviation. Brendan, good morning. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, let's first touch on Jetstar Asia's exit from the Singapore market. What are some of the reasons for this and reactions as well? Is it an opportunity for other airlines to swoop in on routes that Jetstar previously occupied?
Yeah, I mean, the primary reason is Jetstar Asia, has struggled here to make a profit pretty much the entire 2 decades, but particularly in the post-pandemic period. Competition is intense and costs critically have increased a lot to the point that they're unable to generate sufficient revenues given their low-cost carrier business model to offset those costs. And they're also very small, which is important to point out because if you're small, you're kind of subscale, and it's an important component of the low-cost carrier model to have size, to have scale. And post-pandemic, they were at 13 aircraft and only reaching 13 aircraft last year and only had a market share of about 3% in Singapore. So they were small. There are opportunities, particularly for Singapore Airlines Group and the low-cost carrier subsidiary Scoot, to take some of that market share and some of the routes that Jetstar was operating. They were operating 16 routes, and Singapore Airlines Group has already announced that they were going to be launching and or expanding on most of them. So there are opportunities there, as well as for some other carriers to take over that void in the market, rather small void, particularly at this point, given their small size post-pandemic.
Yeah, it's a small void, but it does raise questions about the viability of the low-cost carrier model at an airport like Changi, which is generally considered high cost. How would you like to weigh in on that one?
It definitely is difficult, if you're an independent low-cost carrier like Jetstar Asia was. They're owned by Qantas, and they also had a local shareholder here. But they were independent in that they were primarily relying on local point-to-point traffic, trying to stimulate demand, both outbound and inbound. So, getting Singaporeans to fly more often and also to get tourists into the country. But the issue has been the rise in costs have made that very difficult as a kind of independent low-cost carrier because the taxes at Changi Airport alone are like $70 on departure. So it's very hard to offer low fares when you kind of have that very high tax to begin with. And also that doesn't include the cost that they're paying, for example, for ground handling at Singapore has become very expensive post-pandemic, and other charges and fees and costs that have made it more difficult for these kind of low-cost carriers that rely on very low fares, because the reality is that the costs are just much higher now. The fares have to come up, but if the consumers are used to low fares and, won't accept higher fares, then you have this issue, where you can struggle to sustain operations. So that was Jetstar Asia's, issue that they confronted. Other low-cost carriers that operate in Singapore, some of them also have had these issues, although, a little bit of a different perspective because the other low-cost carriers are mainly from Southeast Asia. They have a bit of a different strategy than, say, Jetstar. Jetstar is Australia-based, and they also have a very good home market, and it was kind of a no-brainer to close up the Singapore operation and move those 13 aircraft into Australia and New Zealand, where the market is much better, where they basically guaranteed to have a profit, while here in Singapore they would struggle to get to profitability.
So to that point, are alliances and joint ventures helping low-cost carriers remain competitive moving forward? You cited the example of Scoot, whose parent company is Singapore Airlines. They benefit from more resources and financial backing. Is that kind of where we see the LCC model going moving forward?
Singapore, definitely. I mean, if you look at regionally, it's a little bit different because while costs have increased everywhere, the costs are still a lot less in other markets in Southeast Asia. Not only the taxes and fees from the airport, but just all costs. While they've increased, they cost are much higher in Singapore. In the Singapore Airlines strategies, being a large kind of airline group and using Scoot to kind of supplement and to feed the main brand Singapore Airlines, it's a little bit different. They're relying a lot more on network traffic. They have a lot more scale because they can benefit from the backing of the larger group. Scoot doesn't necessarily even have to be profitable. Scoot traditionally has been kind of moderately profitable or even like close to break even. Even recently, their profits are very small compared to, say, the Singapore Airlines brand. But that's okay for the group because the group is using Scoot to compete in the lower end of the market and also to provide feed, to actually fill a role that used to be under Silk Air before Silk Air closed. They used to have Silk Air as kind of a regional feeder, but Scoot, post-pandemic, has taken on some of that role. So it's just a different strategy, and in Singapore, that will work, and we'll continue to see Scoot expand over the next several years, while low-cost carriers like AirAsia, they might continue to cut back in Singapore because for them the environment is more challenging.
Yeah, and that challenging environment, to your earlier point, includes airport charges, slot allocations, which is under the purview of the government. What are some of the impact of government policies on low-cost carrier operations?
Yeah, so slots have been very difficult in the last several years, but it should become easier once the three-runway system is introduced at Changi Airport at the end of next year, and then eventually also Terminal 5, which increases the capacity. But the runway thing is actually the main thing, which is much nearer term than Terminal 5 from a slot perspective. So, I mean, the policy is Singapore was very open and receptive to low-cost carriers 20 years ago when we saw the launch of 3 low-cost carriers. They really targeted it. They opened the budget terminal initially. But at the time, they had more capacity, obviously. They had the slots, the runway capacity. They had, the terminal capacity, and even experimented for a few years with that budget terminal. More recently, I think it's just become more challenging to get the slots, and there's no differentiated pricing at the moment. So low-cost carriers have to pay the same fees that full-service carriers here. There's no cheaper terminal. There's no budget option in terms of the services. It's kind of like a full-service premium airport. That's the reality of Changi, right? So it's not like KLIA-2 or something, which if you've flown through there, the differences between KLIA-2 and, say, Changi Airport. But yeah, there's just not that option. And I think it's hard to bring back real low-cost carriers into this market because even as slots open up, the airport charges will continue to increase. They've already announced the next several years of airport charges. So obviously paying for Terminal 5 and all that construction, and also just higher costs in Singapore generally. So there's no way of kind of rolling that back, I would say. The reality is real independent, pure LCCs, in this market might be a bit challenging over time still.
Yeah, I want to turn to the idea of hybrid models maybe as a potential antidote to the challenges that we're seeing on the low-cost carrier front. Budget airlines, for example, offering premium add-ons. Could that be an alternative way to keep the low-cost carrier model sustainable? Combining elements, for example, of low-cost and full-service models to appeal to a wider range of customers, those that are both price-sensitive and the ones who prioritize comfort.
Yeah, I mean, essentially that's what Scoot is doing. It is hybridized already. You have the full-service model, you have the low-cost carrier model, but there's already lots of airlines in the middle. We call these hybrid airlines. But every airline's a little different. Some are more closer to low-cost, and some are more closer to full-service than others. And then even in recent years, you've had this model called ULCC, ultra-low-cost carriers, which is basically created because so many low-cost carriers have hybridized to some extent and have added on services or components of more of a full-service model. But ultra-low-cost carrier model, which kind of become popular in some markets in like Europe and North America, would never work in Singapore because the costs are just too high. It'd be like, somebody like Wizz Air, or Ryanair or Spirit in the U.S., for example. That would never work in Singapore. So really the hybrid model is what definitely can be successful in the kind of higher cost market, because then you have the revenues to kind of justify the higher cost. You have the strategy, you have the network and so forth, and the components to make it work. This is what Scoot has already become. It is already a kind of a hybrid carrier to some extent. I still think it's a little bit more towards a low-cost carrier than full service, but over time it can continue to hybridize potentially. Like I mentioned before, Silk Air, this is quite a key point, is that because Silk Air doesn't exist anymore, Scoot has taken on that role. Silk Air was feeding Singapore Airlines, and Silk Air was a full-service airline, but didn't have some of the amenities, like it didn't have, for example, IFE, in-flight entertainment screens. It didn't have lie-flat business class seats. So it was a full-service airline, but a little bit scaled back, and Scoot has, taken on the Silk Air role. They have a lot higher portion of network traffic than they did before. In other words, transit traffic. That portion is very high for an LCC right now for Scoot. When you transfer to a Singapore Airlines flight or on Singapore Airlines combined Scoot Singapore Airlines ticket, you automatically get these add-ons like baggage and food, drink, and they also have the premium kind of cabin on the 787 as well as extra legroom seats like emergency row, front row. They have a way to kind of cater to some of the network traffic as well as some of the premium traffic. We're already seeing that, but that's specific to Scoot, I would say. Not every airline can come in with a hybrid model. Other airlines will remain pure LCCs and these airlines will be based in other countries in Asia, and then they will still be flying into Singapore with their pure LCC model. But some of these airlines might struggle to compete in the Singapore market because of the high cost environment.
Yeah, it's a fair point. The airline industry is a highly competitive one with very thin profit margins. And against that backdrop, we have been discussing the viability of the low-cost carrier model, especially at high-cost airports like Changi, with Brendan Sobie, who's an independent analyst and consultant at Sobie Aviation. Brendan, thank you so much for your time this morning.
Thank you. I look forward to our next conversation.
Yeah, I look forward to it as well. Stay with Money FM 89.3.
To listen to more great interviews, download our podcasts at audio.sg or download the audio app. That's AWEDIO, audio at the App Store and Google Play.